Hello everybody, I'm Michael Wybrow, and in this video I'm going to do a bit of a follow-up to the week 6 lab exercise with extensions. So the extension task was to add a login screen and customize the current party to be specific to a particular user. So let's have a quick look at what this looks like. I can enter a username. And password. When I do this, assuming I'm already signed up, I come in here and I see that user's information. If I hit log out and come back here and do a different username, and hit login, I see a different set of things. And if I stop this app and relaunch it, it should remember the users that signed in. So it should come into the screen, but still present the logout button. So that's the basic behavior. You can see how it's actually done is we still have a navigation controller, and we've just inserted a login screen between as the root view controller in the navigation controller, and we have a manual segue, which is this segue that is from the view control itself. That means it's not triggered by any particular action, and we call it in code. Now we can have a quick look at how this works. We have two action methods, one for the sign up and one for the login. Each of them use the outlets for these two UI text fields. So let's have a quick look at what that looks like. Here's the login view controller. These are the two action methods. You can see each one has a guard statement where it checks that we've got a username and password text. If we don't, we show a message that says, please enter a username and password. Assuming that we do have a username and password, all we do is we call a method in our database controller to perform the sign up. And this method looks exactly the same for the login, with the exception that we call a different method, one called perform authentication. Now you notice there's no code in here that handles any kind of response from the Firebase controller to let you know whether the user was able to be authenticated or whether the sign up succeeded or failed. And that's because these Firebase calls are asynchronous. So let's go and have a look at these two methods in the Firebase controller. So here they are, and you can see we're ultimately calling two different methods on the auth controller. These are built-in Firebase methods, and we're giving the username and password each time. And the two differences here are we've got a sign-in method and we've got the create user method. So this is the one for signing up a new user. This is the one for logging in with existing credentials. Now, these are async methods that can throw errors. So they'll throw an error if you are not able to sign in. So for example, if I came in here and I did the same account that I did before, and then I entered an invalid password and tried to log in with this, it wouldn't work. And the code path here would be getting to this login failed. And how that's done is that I will await a response here. When it fails, I hit the catch block and I just call my own handle authentication method. So let's have a little bit of a look. That's either we're handling authentication when it succeeded or failed. And what this looks like is this is a method that will notify any interested classes about the authentication state. Now, if we were just using Firebase directory, we could set up an auth listener like we did in the workshop activity in week 6. But if we're using a Firebase control that abstracts away how the authentication is done, We just notify the class that the authentication was successful or not. So ultimately, we're calling a method called onAuthenticationUpdate, and this is defined in our database listener. So we are familiar with onTeamChange, onAllHeroChange, and we've added a new one here called onAuthenticationUpdate. And all it does is return a Boolean value that is true or false. So this code looks like the listener calling code like we would have called in our snapshot listener when we had got updates to the team or updates to the list of superheroes. The only exception is before we notify the class that the login was successful, we set up the necessary listeners for the hero listener and the team listener. And this is sort of a chain. The hero listener calls the setup team listener method. And this is only done if there's a user that's logged in. If the login failed, we obviously don't set up the listeners because we don't listen to a team for a non-existent user. And so that's what that code looks like. And this is all via the same multicast listener kind of pattern, which is sort of like delegation, but delegation where there's multiple classes potentially listening. And this is the same as in our lab exercises. Now, the way these listeners work is you've got two different situations. One situation is where I have a username and password here, and I enter a valid password and I click login. And the code flow there is this perform authentication method will get called. It will spawn a background task and it will return immediately. So at that point, my login controller has called this perform authentication, and then it's dropped back out and carried on with what it's doing. At some point in the future, it will be notified, and it will be notified via the listener, and it will be calling this method on authentication update, which is this one here. And we can see, what does it do if the authentication update was successful? It performs the manual segue to log in the user, which goes to their team, or it will display a message, which is login failed. And that's what we see here when we see login failed. It's calling the on authentication update, saying it failed, and hitting this code path. So that's one particular situation that can happen. The second one, though, is what happens when we launch the app and the user's already signed in. Because in that case, we're not calling this action or this action, but we still need to notice the user is signed in. And the same as the way we register other listeners, and this is the same as the snapshot listeners that are built into Firebase work, is when you first set up the listener, it calls back and lets you know the result. So if we have a look in the Firebase controller and have a look at our add listener method, this part would have been what you would have seen before and probably had if you hadn't done the extension activity. And then we've got a final case here, which is checking for a new listener type, the auth one. And this will get called when this view controller becomes visible. It will register itself as a listener with the Firebase controller. And at that point, it will add itself as a delegate to the list of listeners. And like any of the listeners, they, like the team change listener reports back the default team's heroes. The on all hero change listener reports back the full list of heroes, or our auth listener reports back if the user is logged in. And it has to do two things. It has to set up the correct listeners at this point, snapshot listeners I'm talking about with Firebase. And then it needs to tell this view controller here that the user is logged in. And that's why when we launch the app, if the user's already signed in, it's this line here that will notify this view controller, and it will perform the segue before the user even has a chance to enter any details because the user's already logged in. So if I was to say, not have this code here, no, actually, I'll tell you what I'll do. First of all, I'll sign in so you can see this work. So let me enter my password here, click login, and if I quit the app and relaunch, you'll see it will launch straight to, it won't show the authentication screen, so it goes straight to the current party. But if I took out this part, then, and this is what a lot of students miss, then it forces me to log in each time. And if I do log in and enter like my details, then everything will work fine. Because we hit a different kind of situation there, which was we add ourselves as a listener, and then we call the Firebase methods, which at a later point call back the listener. And we can find that again was the perform signup, calls handle authentication, and handle authentication calls this on authentication update. So this version triggers in response to the asynchronous calls where you either create a user or sign in. And this version we were looking at before is the one that gets called initially when the view controller loads. And incidentally, the reason that we don't have the false case here, which we could put in, just have a look what happens, but if we do this, then even if the user enters nothing and they're signed out, we're going to see an error message, which makes no kind of sense for the user. So we can have a look what this would look like. Basically, if we were logged out when the app launches, then we just see a login failed. And the user would look at that and go, well, that's strange. I never actually entered my details, and they have to dismiss this before they can enter a valid one. So that's kind of how the listeners work. Okay, so we saw how the listener approach works. I want to show you one other way to handle this situation. The whole reason we needed listeners here was because the calls to Firestore or Firebase authentication are asynchronous, but it is possible to make these two methods, my perform signup and perform authentication, that are part of my database controller, also be asynchronous. And then we could just write a task code here that waits for the result. And we could then kind of clean up our logic and take the code we have here and kind of build it into my signup tapped method. So this is not following the pattern that's in the live class, but it is an interesting and neat way of doing this. And it's an extension of what we've seen, and that we've never written our own async methods. So let me show you what this could look like. We'll just have a go at writing it now. What we would need to do is in our database protocol, we would find, no, sorry, not the database protocol. Yes, I am, sorry. Right, in the database protocol, we would find these couple of methods here, perform authentication, perform signup, and we would change these and make them async and throws. And this basically says they can throw an error, and the code of this method is asynchronous. So it's supposed to be called from within like a task block. So we change this here. We obviously also need to change it in the Firebase controller. Perform authentication. So it's this one. And this one here. Now, this kind of means we wouldn't have to use a listener for the for handling authentication. We would just call this method inside a task block and await its result. So what does this look like? Well, even though we're calling asynchronous code in here, because the method itself is asynchronous, we no longer need the task block in here. So we can get rid of that. And we've got a do catch block because we're catching the result of this sign in, which can throw. But if it can throw, then we can just pass that error being thrown back up to the calling method. So we also don't need the do catch block here. So we can basically have this kind of thing. We were calling handle authentication as a way of notifying other code that something had occurred. What we do need to do here is we need to set up the hero listener, and I'm going to do that in here and basically do it straight after this code. And that's okay because we try and sign in. If we succeed, we get to the next line. If we don't, we throw, and we just leave this method immediately. So I can do that. My code for the other one of these methods looks very similar, just like this. And I would no longer need this main actor or this handle authentication method. Main actor because it was calling code that runs on that updates the UI and runs on the main thread. So we've got, we now need to do this in a task block because this method is now asynchronous. It can now throw an error. Oops. So we need to put it in a do catch block. So we'd have something like this. Try await and catch. And basically what we want to be doing is the kind of thing that we're doing in this on authentication update, which is if it succeeds, we would want to perform our segue. If it fails, we would want to show this display message. Okay, so that's what this code would look like now. Okay, that's because we had a local variable called username. So we can pretty much do exactly the same thing in the other one of these methods, which is in the login. That was the sign-in tapped one. Here we've got the login button, and the only difference is it calls a method called perform authentication. So we put this here, and instead we call perform authentication. Again, trying and waiting the result. And when we've got that, we can have a look at the code flow. So basically, now our perform authentication method we wrote is marked async and throws. So it calls asynchronous code and waits for it to finish, and it sets up the hero listener when it's done, and then it returns, or it at this point throws, and it will just exit this method and pass that back to the catch block that this is called from. And same with the other one. So we're going to have a look at this. We've got a task block, runs in the background. We try and await the authentication. When it gets its result, if it throws, we come here and say login failed. If it succeeds, we perform a segue here. So we can have a look at this. This should, in theory, work. That's the normal version. Let's try the one where we log in. So you can see that's a potentially sort of cleaner version that doesn't require us to have the authentication listeners, but it also means we structure our code a bit different. So I also just wanted to show you that version because it's a different way of thinking about and writing this kind of method where you have to wait for it to do something in the background and get a result. Okay, thanks for watching.